and welcome to Formation, a weekly conversation for followers of Jesus. And I am excited to be in the official driver's seat.
You are in the middle chair.
You finally made it after
I finally
you
made it.
Come a
punched your
long
way.
way, Kara.
I've worked hard to get to this moment. And so I'm looking forward to our conversation about Mark today. But before we get started, we have some fan mail.
We have fans?
We have fans.
Exciting.
We have a fan. And so Judy Stimple sent us some information about what she thinks about the Gospels, and here are some of Judy's words. She likes Luke and John the best, but Matthew and Mark too. It's hard to choose. As she says, how does a parent choose a favorite child?
That's a good
Sophie's
way to...
choice moment. And her aha moment was that she did not realize until she went to seminary that each of the Gospels came from a unique community. And so the question becomes, what was going on in that community when the Gospel was written? What particular perspective does the community have? It's fascinating and powerful. And so
it reminds me of a sermon. If you've ever tried to reuse a sermon in a different church, it doesn't work.
It's very specific. Yes. And it's what we love about the variety.
Right.
is the detective work that has been done to say what was going on.
Right.
And I didn't mean to say that the Gospels don't work because they're not, but just the perspective.
Right.
To remember that each one was written, with a certain purpose.
Yeah, and also when we're reading them, that we're reading them for a certain group of people as well.
Right.
And I think that has been for me recently in a seminary course, one of the most profound things. Like when I read this, whether I'm working with children or whether I'm working with adults, I'm reading it for that group too. And so always the context is so important to what we're doing.
Context,
Great
yes.
observation.
So that brings us into the Gospel of Mark. For a long time, we learned that Mark was kind of not considered very important. Mark was just thought it was kind of this addendum to everything, but it turns out Bible scholars have said, actually, no. Actually, Mark was incredibly important. And Mark was most likely the first gospel that was written and was on the tables of those other Matthew and Luke as those were being written as well. And so it's a short book for sure, and it gets right to the point. And so one of the ways that this happens is in all of the Gospels, the word euthus is used more than any other, which is immediately. So if we can hear Mark 1:18 through 23, Shannon, if you'll read that, and let's just listen for how quickly the pace of Mark moves us.
Right. Okay. And immediately they left their nets and followed him. As he went a little farther, he saw James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, who were in the boat mending nets. Immediately he called them, and they left their father in the boat with the hired men and followed him. They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, he entered the synagogue and taught. They were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. Just then, there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with me, with us, Jesus, son of Nazareth?" So there's immediately, just then.
Right. Yeah, the Strauss Strauss talks about the idea that it's this on-the-scene reporting. Renee, can you tell us a little bit about maybe some of your expertise in on-the-scene reporting? And what that looks like?
I like that comparison. I like the energy of Mark. I like the active verbs, and so if you're on the scene reporting, you're pivoting a lot. That's a word that we learned in the pandemic, isn't it? How to pivot. The church had to pivot, but you're reacting to what's going on. You're not coming in thinking, all right, I know the story, because the story keeps shifting, and it's important to keep the attention of your viewers. And so you're energetic in how you proclaim it, but you're telling the story in real time. And that's what it feels like with Mark. Right. It's not something that was composed very carefully and studiously. It's action-packed. Right. And I like that someone's following along behind Jesus is what it feels like, right?
Right.
And just reporting, here's what I'm seeing. Not so much conclusion being drawn, do you think? But just let the reader draw their own conclusions. But here's what I saw. I was right there on the scene. Here's what I saw.
When you were in news, did you prefer to have those live on the scene reports as opposed to something that had been pre-prepared that you delivered?
You know, we had, because it was so long ago, it was really back before television was even in color. No, it wasn't that long ago. But we had the TV station I worked for, the ABC affiliate had just spent a lot of money on on the ability to do live on the scene reporting. And so what happened in my experience was things that didn't require being live on the scene. I mean, it was just like, okay, we've got to demonstrate that we needed to spend all that money. So
I see.
Sometimes it was something where something had happened and now it's over. And so you're just standing and all the lights are off in the building. And, you know.
They still do that, though.
I know, every now and then. You know, at 10 o'clock, it's not happening anymore, but you pretend like
But I was
it is.
there.
I was there. These lights are going to come on very soon. This is what's going to happen. Yeah. What do you think about the pace of this? Had you noticed the immediately?
I had.
Okay.
Yeah, it's one of the things I love about Mark, just because it gives a sense of urgency. You want to find out what happens next.
Yeah, and it's that word is used more in the book of Mark than any place else. So throughout, just keeps us moving. There are a lot of other just kind of literary uses in Mark, and so things like things happen in threes. Can you think of any of those things in Mark?
Give us a hint.
Yeah.
There are three. Think about when they're praying in the garden. 3 times, Jesus has to come back and say, "I told you to wake up."
Does he predict his death 3 times?
3 times his death is predicted. 3 times, we have 3 boat stories, which I wasn't aware that there are 3 water stories in there as well. And so we see a lot of the things that we've already talked about. So this repetition that is used to kind of make the point, as well as that sandwiching. So Mark does a lot of, here's a story, let me tell you a little more, and then we'll continue on that story. So one of those examples...
So the sandwiching thing is kind of like breaking news. Yeah. You're reporting along. Wait, breaking news, and then a new slide comes up, and then you're talking about something else.
And now we're going to finish the story.
And then you go back and finish your previous story.
Yeah, and so Mark is often trying to bring in the outsiders. And so one way that he does that is through the use of parables. And so we will read one of these parables. So Renee, if you will read Mark 4, verses 30 and through 32.
The parable of the mustard seed. Again, Jesus said, "What shall we say the kingdom of God is like? Or what parable shall we use to describe it? It is like a mustard seed, which is the smallest seed you plant in the ground. Yet when planted, it grows and becomes the largest of all garden plants, with such big branches that the birds of the air can perch in its shade."
What do you think about that?
It's very visual. I love it. I love thinking of the kingdom as something that begins in small ways. I think we use that imagery a lot as we begin a new ministry, planting seeds, believing God is calling us to do something that then expands and becomes larger.
And even in this instance, this, I think, if I'm not mistaken, is the third seed analogy that Mark uses in this. There's a parable of the sower, where the sower sows the seeds, and then there's a couple of other parables, and then he says the kingdom of God is like a seed that's scattered. You don't know how it grows, and now the mustard seed. So he's using this repetition. He's using the symbolism, the parable. It's very interesting how he does that.
Yeah, and so he takes that moment to speak to the crowd in this unique way that some scholars would say kind of helps to let the outsider in, but kind of keep the insider out, because it's so simple. How could this be so simple? But Jesus, as we will learn throughout this, always has some issues in Mark with his disciples. So Renee, will you read what follows immediately after what you just read?
Immediately after, the birds of the air can perch in its shade. With many similar parables, Jesus spoke the word to them as much as they could understand. He did not say anything to them without using a parable. But when he was alone with his own disciples, he explained everything.
What does that tell us about what Mark thinks?
Well, even earlier, he had given a parable, and the disciples had asked for an explanation, and Jesus said something like, if you don't understand this one, you're not going to get the others.
It's not very encouraging.
There's a little frustration, I think, on Jesus' part.
Yeah, and repeatedly we see that Jesus tells these wonderful, amazing stories, or interact. I think of the feeding of the 5,000 that comes very soon after the parable of the mustard seed, and this miracle just happened, and then the disciples are like, well, I don't know what we're going to do next. What does that? How do we think about that today?
I think it's us. I think it's me. I think it's how often God has to put something in front of me before it clicks.
I've thought to myself, how many times do I have to learn this lesson?
Right.
Here we go again. I'm in the same situation. I've learned this lesson, but apparently I didn't.
Right.
So here it is again, and I think this is a good analogy of that.
So I think
Jesus
there's
presents.
grace. I think there's grace in how long it takes the disciples to get it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And
That's what it
which
feels like to
provides
me.
a little hope for us,
Yes.
as people who
If they
are
were
trying
just
to walk.
brilliant and immediately
Right.
got it, I would be discouraged by the lifetime journey it's taken me to
Right.
listen
Yeah.
accurately to what God is telling me.
Right. And just the consistency of it. Just that you always know there's going to be a lesson in it. To me, that's part of it. Like they never just say, "Oh, we've got this. Don't worry, Jesus, we'll take this on."
Right.
Because they're constantly amazed or confused or living into this life that is so unlike anything they've ever imagined before.
So this makes me think, all right, we've had some formal presentation. Then they go to the back room and sit down and have some refreshments. And Jesus gives them the Cliff Notes.
Right.
All right, and let's talk about today. What did you hear that you didn't understand?
Exactly.
But how genius, though, to not just lay it out in a way that gives more conversation, more opportunity for discussion and growth and sharing and vulnerability, rather than do this, this, and this.
Right.
But instead, let's talk about it. How does this affect your life? What does this mean to you?
Yeah, and the parables that are can go in so many different ways too. I mean, I just think just brilliant.
Yes.
Parables are
Yes.
brilliant
Yeah.
in the ways that they're used to tell us different stories, different meanings, different ways that each individual can connect and learn something new from it.
Agreed.
They're remarkable. Well, let's move on, and if you will read for us, Shannon, from Mark 9, verses 33 through 37. This is more conversation about the disciples.
Okay. They came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another who was the greatest. He sat down and called the 12 and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." Then he took a little child and put it among them, and taking it in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me."
What do you think about that?
How typical, this arguing about who's the greatest. What I will say about the disciples is that at least they did it to each other.
Right.
It wasn't hidden. There wasn't that. At least they were honest enough to be arguing about it out loud to one another.
Right.
And they also recognized that was not the thing to do when Jesus asked them what they were arguing about. But I love that Jesus used a child as an example. And you probably have some thoughts about that as a children's minister.
Well, I think that, when children are used as examples in the Gospels, it's almost always to demonstrate this moment of, it's okay. Like, you have to be as small as this child. I also have a very high opinion and esteem for children and all that they can do in their creativity and all of that. And I believe that Jesus did that as well. But but to say, here, if you want to be the greatest, you have to be like this, a child who's learning and growing and figuring it all out. Like, you don't know it yet. Do you have any ideas on this?
I love the way Jesus is teaching that. I just think there's something so humble and yet very elegant in that lesson.
Yeah.
And children were at the bottom of the list.
Absolutely
In this society. No power, no status.
Nothing.
And Jesus is uplifting that. And so it
was long
shows
before
God's,
Fred Rogers helped us
Yes.
pay attention to children.
and shows God's
Jesus
care
was on the
for the weak and the
cutting edge.
vulnerable.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And this is one of the first conversations in Mark where we see this idea of servant leadership. And that idea that Jesus is teaching them in order to lead, you have to step up and serve others in order to do that. And so we see that as this kind of consistent theme. And when we look at the Gospel of Mark, we look at this idea that, Jesus was a servant leader. And what does that mean? Any ideas? What does it mean to be a servant leader? Beyond when we look at the life of Jesus?
I think it's a little bit more popular now in teaching,
Right.
even in the business world, to think about how you lead by example, how you're non-hierarchical, that whatever needs to be done, you demonstrate as a leader the right ways to do it by rolling up your sleeves and doing it alongside the people who are reporting to you. So now I think it's kind of a trendy thing,
Right.
but other than people who had read the scroll of Isaiah, nobody would have known anything about that.
Right.
But I think the struggle now in the society in which we live is that there's also this temptation to be recording yourself rolling your sleeve up. Watch me be a servant leader.
Yes,
And
good
then-
point.
So
I am
there's-
the most servant of all.
Of all the leaders.
And I think social media is sort of like this argument the disciples were having of who's the greatest,
Right.
who gets the most likes, who gets the most shares, who gets the most reposts. It's more subtle, but it's there.
Right. Absolutely. And what we see, we're going to switch now. Well, Renee, you're going to read in just a second. But on page 230 of the Strauss book that we've been looking at, there is a diagram and this idea about how Jesus teaches this 3 times, this lesson. And so, Renee, if you'll read this series that happens, and we'll talk about it, but beginning in verse 8, or chapter 8, verse 31.
Chapter 8, verse 31, Jesus predicts his death. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," Jesus said. "You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men." Then he called the crowd to him along with the disciples and said, "If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for a man to gain the whole world and yet forfeit his soul? Or what can a man give in exchange for his soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels."
Yeah, this is the first episode that we see, this kind of first prediction where Jesus says, I'm going to die. And what does Peter do?
No, you're not. Don't stop talking like that.
Right. And I kind of feel for Peter in that moment.
I do too. But for Peter to rebuke Jesus,
Right.
he was a little too big for his britches, as my grandmother would say. I mean,
Right.
don't you want to?
Yes.
I wish that the on-the-scene reporting had recorded what that conversation was. How was it that Peter just would tell Jesus, "No, you're wrong"?
Right.
I can't even believe that happened.
Right. And Jesus' profound answer to that, get behind me. Like, that statement is enough for me to really, have a pretty powerful response. I can't imagine something more powerful to be said. And then we see Jesus not just go away, but to teach in that moment. Here's what's going to happen. If you want to follow me, you have to take up your cross.
And, the thing that we don't like to talk about, it may happen to you too. Right. You may have difficult times or be persecuted or killed.
Right.
And we don't like to talk about that because it's really uncomfortable. And I would like to rebuke Jesus at that moment.
Oh no, rebuking Jesus.
But I don't, because
don't do it, Shannon.
But I don't,
You'd be
because
in
I
a
know
new
better.
gospel.
That's right.
He'd be mentioned.
All this happens 3 times, and it gets us to this what Strauss calls the climax of this whole gospel, and it is Mark 10:45, and it says, "For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." So that idea that Jesus came as this kind of suffering Messiah, the servant who came for all of us. I love Mark. Mark's going to be my favorite now. Maybe until we talk about another gospel.
We should immediately read it all the way through.
We should. Our 3rd grade Bible class, actually, I'm encouraging them to have a little path to read all through Mark, because it's one of those gospels that's kind of moves in a good entry for
What a great idea.
So one of the texts that I had when I was in seminary was Mark as story. And it was the Gospel of Mark, pulled out all of the verse numbers, all of the chapters, so that you read uninterrupted. And it really gave you a sense of the immediacy, the action. It was really great.
I like that.
That's great. Yeah. Well, thank you all for being kind and following along.
You did
and
a good job.
This was
did.
fun.
Thank you, Kara.
This was fun. And so we look forward to seeing you next week on Formation. If you have any fan mail, like Judy did, please send us something at formation@uccftw.com, and we look
Or even
forward
a
to
question.
or a question, or something you want us to talk about or cover, or that we didn't make any sense and you'd like us to try again. We'll try, but this has been fun. So thank you, and we'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.